Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 207th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this video, I'll just briefly touch on this whole situation with the Strait of Hormuz, because many people are talking about it. It is a rather tragic time, obviously, with the war between the United States and Iran. And I just wanted to explore again the more symbolic dimensions of these conflicts, because many people are stuck in the more geopolitical analysis and more materialistic one. And so I wanted to try and look at this whole situation in a more symbolic way. So the first thing to talk about is the loss of confidence in centralized structures, power structures. So we can see Trump that's completely derailing, completely inconsiderate of the impact of his actions on, how it reverberates throughout the whole world. And this is just, as I so often discussed in many of my videos, it is just this transition that is necessary for a society to be completely lose confidence in the institutions that they have in order to move on to something else. And it is the same kind of event as a young adult that is still living with his parents, that needs to be shocked into realizing that his parents are not perfect and that they're running their household terribly, in order to seek their autonomy and independence. And so far, humanity has never been disappointed enough in their institutions to say, look, this is not working. We need to find other ways of organizing ourselves. So far, it's more about electing the right politician, because if we have the right politician at the head of, the state, then everything will be fine. And then it's just a matter of competing political parties and finding the right political party. And if only you voted for the right politician, then everything will be fine. And it's a similar situation as an adolescent or a teenager that's living in his parents' house, just hoping that the next negotiation with his parents is going to yield the positive results that they're seeking. Like, for instance, being able to dress with their own clothes and their own style, or listen to their own music, or have new rights like coming later in the evening, or having more pocket money. And society has been in that kind of relationship with our centralized governments for the last 200 or 300 years, which is the adolescent stage of humanity, let's say. Always hoping that there's going to be the next reform of the government, which is going to solve all the problems. And now is the time where humanity kind of needs to be shocked into this realization that no, these kinds of centralized infrastructure and structures will no longer yield positive results, and you can't really hope for anything better for them because they are in a kind of gridlock. I mean, just think back of the very last time that our democracies have experienced major reforms in terms of their constitution, in terms of how they were functioning, in terms of new rights that they were granted to citizens, in terms of better process. The discourse now is, this is the best system we've got. There's no alternative, Tina. And it's just going to run like this for the next foreseeable future. And let's not discuss any profound transformations, like, for instance, creating a second parliament made up of citizens that are, appointed by sorting, just randomly, like, in some trials in the judicial system, or some major, new constitutional safeguards. Now it's more about, running this because it's all settled, it's all done, it's all stable and everything. And, focus on this very technocratic, very detailed things like fisheries and this and that. And it doesn't mean that, you won't get some positive developments out of this. It just means that you can feel the strain of these centralized institutions to move humanity forward at this point. because there's just no major progress in that direction. And somebody always has to go first, which means not all young adults move out of their parents' home at the same time. And some people need to be shocked a little bit more into out of complacency. And so if you look at some of our elected officials, it almost looks like they are the perfect fit for each society to sort of wake them into realization that this just isn't working anymore. And Trump is the perfect one for the US. You can have others, for other countries. But I mean, I was thinking like of Boris Johnson in the UK was, well, you know what I mean. All kinds of other ones. We've tried them all, basically, at this point. We've tried them all. And now we're almost selecting the worst ones almost on purpose. It's almost like, lighting a fire underneath your butt in order to jump out of the chair that you've been sitting on too long. And so what is the young adult stage? Well, the young adult stage is self-governance. That is what we're moving towards. Like the moment where you seek your independence from your parents is the moment where you self-organize. And so you're no longer subjected to these centralized authorities, but you set up structures and systems whereby you can directly, govern yourselves through those systems. And that is all the developments in blockchain, decentralized autonomous organizations, and even the tools that we have at our disposal, like AI, which is capable of processing immense amounts of data. For instance, what people think, what people want, aggregate it and allow this kind of, feedback loop or recursivity of society with itself in order to make decisions collectively quicker and react faster to things. So that is the general sort of institutional analysis that I wanted to share that is symbolic at this point. But then I've just watched a video of Steve Keen, link in the description, about the fact that we're going to experience in 2 or 3 months, we might experience a major famine because, the fertilizers stock is running low. And therefore, humanity will not be able to have the same kind of level of food production.
Food production on the planet could fall 10, 25%, and therefore there simply won't be enough food for everyone on the planet. And then it's a question of who's going to starve. I think we are definitely going to see famines all over the planet. They don't understand how critical and how fragile our production systems are. So people can talk about a war in Iraq and think, oh, that's a war in Iran and that's going to cut off our oil supply. No, it's going to cut off your food supply.
And here I'll enter into a much deeper symbolic analysis, an analysis that I've done already 6 years ago in one of the first videos I posted on the channel. I've always, there's a certain number of fractal levels that you can analyze the situation that we're in symbolically. One of those is obviously what I was saying about this mirroring between a relationship of a human being to their parents, and growing up in a family, and the relationship of citizens and a society to its governments, which is like one fractal above. So there's this mirroring of those two relationships. But then the fractals, there's two fractal layers below, which is the relationship of a baby to its mother when it's growing inside its womb. Because upon birth, a baby loses also like 1/10 of its weight, which would mean that there's still going to be some people that are going to suffer and die before everything sort of works again as it should. And time and again, I've compared humanity to an organism that is growing inside this planetary womb, where we're kind of protected and shielded from the universe, the cold universe in which we couldn't survive without the atmosphere, obviously, of the planet that shields us from, that allows us to breathe, for one thing, but also that shields us from so many different things, like the ozone layer filters out a lot of the sunlight that would kill us. The electromagnetic field of this planet filters out, cosmic radiation, solar flares, and like the bulk of all kinds of toxic information from the outer, so from the wilder universe, let's say, that would where we would not survive if we wouldn't have that kind of barrier and protective layer. And ultimately, the womb inside in a mother basically serves that same kind of purpose. It also creates the ideal conditions, microclimate for the baby in order for those cells to grow and grow in a way to create a mutual interdependence between the different organs in such a way as to enable that organism to survive outside the protective barrier of the skin of the mother, and this microclimate that she's creating inside of her, once everything sort of clicks into place. And as humanity, we are reaching a similar kind of point whereby we are fast developing technology which allows humanity to survive in space. But it entails functioning like a global collective harmonious organism and not like, various strains of cancer that are battling for dominance over this planet. And that is coming back to the conflict between different states, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or United States, Iran, or Israel, Palestine. Ultimately, you can analyze these as autoimmune diseases or cancer, like various strains of cancer growing in your body, or like your stomach trying to digest your intestines or something, like something as crazy as that. Although if you do take an interest in Michael Levin's work, which I highly recommend, which is a microbiologist, he does discuss the idea that during gestation, the various organs in a baby are in a sort of a competition, growing inside the body with each other, because it ensures their fitness. That is that kind of struggle, that kind of friction of like growing in that pocket, in that bioelectric field, and pushing against the other organs and saying like, where's the limit between this, or how I want to expand and grow, and the other organs. It ensures that they're much more resilient and fit. And obviously humanity has pushed this way too far, because there's one thing is competition, the other thing is total annihilation, like we've done with certain cultures where we've committed genocide, or like with native Indians, and completely eradicated their culture in the US or in America. But the idea symbolically is the same, where you have a certain amount of competition, which should be healthy competition, in order to sort of push us forward as humanity to be better, but not in a way where you completely collapse and crush your competitors. So again, like a symbolic analysis and organological analysis allows you to have a kind of bird's eye view of what's happening, where these events have sometimes much deeper meaning, and you can read it through astrology as well. Astrology is a good point of analysis where you can see the patterns in the broader cosmos, which are reflected in human actions, but you can also see that's from the micro to the macro to the micro. But you can also see the reverse, where micro experiences that we've all had as humanity sort of blow up at the macro. And obviously all of that is tied intimately. And so you can have those kinds of readings. And the interesting aspect about that is that every reading enables you to react or understand these situations differently and live through those events differently. And the reason why I'm trying to discuss this is to try to live through them consciously, and then take actions which do not stir up more karma or more complications further down the road. And so again, one of the first videos I've discussed that there's also a very important transition when a baby is born, where you are no longer that protective layer inside your mother's body. And there are two fractal layers here, where one fractal layer is cutting the umbilical cord and the relationship of the baby to the placenta, which is a centralized organism or organ through which all the resources flow when the baby is still inside the womb. And the baby is quite dependent on the placenta and it's that kind of centralized organ for all of its resources. And if that organ fails, the baby basically suffocates in the womb. Now, a layer above that, fractally, you have the relationship of a child to their parents, whereby if the parents fail to provide, when the child is very little, fail to provide resources to the child, in many cases, in many societies, that meant death for the child. If your parents can no longer feed you as a baby, then you're basically dead. And it's the same kind of relationship as the placenta stop trickling, blood of the mother, the resources of the mother. So basically, you could think of parents as being the symbolic intermediaries between the society's resources, like the mother's blood in the case of the mother, and the child. The child cannot access society's resources on his own. He needs to go through his parents. So a 3 or 4 year old child cannot just walk up to the store, grab groceries and walk out, right? They need their parents to go and work and then to have money and then buy groceries and then cook and then etc. And then at a fractal level above that, you have a society access to the planetary resources of this planet. And you can see that we're accessing these resources through centralized organisms like nation states, like giant big corporations. As a human being now, if you want to access this planet's resources, you have to hold property titles, you have to abide by the laws, you have to do all kinds of things, set up giant corporations or whatever. And so we are accessing, the various resources like oil through very centralized channels. And one thing that can happen during birth or before birth is the placenta can calcify, which means there's less bloodstream that's flowing to the baby. Also, what can happen is when the birthing is actually taking place, there are various ways to go about the severance of the cutting of the umbilical cord. And so in our modern, quote unquote modern Western societies, one common practice is just clamping the umbilical cord and then cutting the placenta. And that you do that outright, like in the few minutes after the baby is born. Now, what happens after that is that the baby typically loses about 10% of its body weight during the next few days because its metabolism, its organ is not yet fully, the different organs are not yet fully developed. Like the stomach isn't like fully developed to process, the mother's milk, and the lungs are not mature enough to process oxygen and replace the flow of steady flow of resources that's streaming through the bloodstream directly from the mother through the placenta. And in that video that I've published 6 years ago, I said that 10% of the body weight basically amounts to, well, I don't know if I mentioned how many humans that means, but it's basically around 700 to 800 million humans. If you take 10% of humanity, in a baby, if a baby is 3 kilograms and 10%, that baby loses 10% of the weight during the two or three first days, it means an excess mortality of cells compared to the birth of new cells. And at the scale of humanity, that means about 700 to 800 million deaths. And in those videos, if you look at my channel, time and again, I've compared oil, petrol, to the blood, quote unquote blood of this planet, whereby the relationship is fractally identical. In order for the baby to access quote unquote infinite energy, which is the oxygen that the mother breathes on the outside, which is virtually limitless and infinite. In order for the baby to access that energy needs to be metabolized by the mother. So the mother breathes the oxygen, then that oxygen is processed by her own lungs, then it circulates through the bloodstream, and then it goes through the placenta to the baby. So the baby cannot access that infinite clean energy that the mother's breathing every single second on his own, because he doesn't have the right organs or maturity yet. Now, for humanity, if you think of oil is what? Oil is sun energy. And any energy on this planet is solar energy, if you think about it. It's just that oil is very old sun energy that has been metabolized again by this planet. That is, plants grew, dinosaurs ate the plants, dinosaurs decompose for hundreds of millions of years into oil. And then we can consume that very old blood or metabolized solar energy through centralized organs like our huge corporations and states that grant these contracts to these big companies to extract the oil from the ground. And what is this transition of birth then, and the baby that once on the outside can breathe with his own lungs and doesn't need to go through the mother's lungs and her metabolization process to access the same energy? Well, we see the signs already, like we are transitioning gradually to solar energy. Solar panels are a start, but that is to me symbolically equivalent to a baby before birth. A baby has hiccups in the womb, which serve the purpose of opening up the lungs so that they're ready once the baby's born in order to take the full breath. What would be the equivalent of the symbolically of the moment the baby's born taking its first breath? And that would be something like nuclear fusion, like a revolutionary breakthrough in nuclear fusion. Why? Because ultimately, nuclear fusion is like recreating the sun's energy directly here on Earth. So it's almost like the sun represents the inaccessible energy that the mother is breathing on the outside and metabolizing for you, that you can't really access because your lungs are immature. But then once you have your lungs, they belong to you. It's like this is something that is yours now. And you can access that same energy that is infinite, but directly, not mediated via, this external kind of relationship. But again, it wouldn't be nuclear fusion in the sense of, which is what these huge corporations and states want to do, which is these mega projects of like 200 billion euro huge reactor where it's all in a huge company. Because think about it, like the moment the baby breathes with its own lungs, that energy is freely accessible to all the cells. The oxygen flows through the body seamlessly. It's not like there are these mega corporations that control who can, the stream of oxygen goes to this and that, and this household has paid the taxes, so they're going to get the energy. No, it's like really, it's almost like universal in a way. And so you read articles from time and again, and there was one article where there was this teenager that just recreated a mini nuclear fusion reactor in his room or something using AI and just research and putting things together. And to me, it's more of that kind of breakthrough that's going to happen is some kind of scientist or some collective is going to open source this technology, make it available on a smaller scale where each city even can have their own mini nuclear fusion reactor and power their own cities. And then, the whole grid is kind of interconnected in a very resilient way. Which is how an organism normally, a mature organism, actually that's what it resembles. It's not this kind of it's a more integrated approach of everything interdependent with everything else, and this idea of resilience rather than this idea of centralized control. And that is, to me, again, just symbolically the same kind of moment where it's almost as if the cells of the placenta suddenly realize that they are at a moment in the baby's development where they may become irrelevant and die and don't want to die. And so they do everything they can to hold the baby still inside the womb where the baby is dependent on the placenta. And it's the parents, sometimes some parents do the same thing. Like they feel like their young adult is about to leave the parent's nest and they're like, oh my God, now I'm not going to have control over what my young adult is doing. Maybe he'll use his first salary to buy drugs and all kinds of illegal stuff. I need to maintain control over his accounts and what he's doing. And some governments seem to be in the same kind of vibe, and some corporations as well. It's like, oh no, humanity now is developing these open source technologies where maybe they can be independent energetically, and maybe they can be independent with, open source AI running directly on their devices, where they have all the intelligence to coordinate and solve all their problems. No. We want to keep control over everything. And again, like, if you view this fractally, then that means that what's happening now with the Strait of Hormuz is just a symbolic equivalent to this dominant way of the West of, clamping the umbilical cord and cutting it, and then the baby is basically left struggling, shifting from one way of accessing energy, accessing resources, to another one very abruptly. But there are other ways of doing things. There is what's called lotus birth, where after birth you leave the placenta attached, and the last amount of resources can still flow through, while the lungs and all the other organs gain more maturity. And in that case, normally the transition is much more seamless, and there's much less strain on the organism and on the baby, and less loss of weight loss. And so this means that as humanity, we are still under it's not like this is a fatality that has to happen. That is, we are not destined for experiencing in 3 months a mass famine where between 7 and 800 million people have to die because there's no fertilizers and there's a food shortage. It's not like it's written in the stars. I mean, it's like every birth is different. Every baby is born differently. Every young adult gains an autonomy from his parents in a different way. Like, you don't have to be the young adult that runs away from their parents and then have to go live under a bridge for a few days or a few months before you find a job or whatever. It can be smooth. It can. And that's why I'm posting these videos, is because, Steve Keen has this more down-to-earth analysis of like cause and effect, and this is what's happening. But at any point in time, as humanity, our global state of consciousness affects how we're going to experience this situation and this experience. And my hope, as always, is to advocate for the smooth transition, and at the same time to recognize that if humanity needs, for some reason, to go through this hardship in order to gain the necessary maturity to handle infinite clean energy, or to give itself objective reasons to transition to self-governance, then I cannot, me as a little person, I cannot just say, let's just cancel all of this and do the smooth transition, because it's not in the cards. It's not meant to be. But by becoming aware of these patterns, of the karma, of all the different possibilities for transitioning, we can choose consciously which ones of these alternatives scenarios we want to experience. And so, yeah, it's again the same situation as some babies or some infants can be told not to put their hand on a burning stove, and they'll integrate. They won't need to have the experience of actually putting their hand on the stove and having their fingers burned or whatever in order to learn not to do that. And I'm still hopeful that humanity is the kind of organism that can be told of the symbolic dimensions of behind many of these events, and can integrate the right kind of lessons or things to be integrated without necessarily experiencing the hardships. That is my hope. And so, yeah, again, like this the constriction of the Strait of Hormuz is equivalent to either a calcification, a gradual calcification of the placenta, which means there's less blood flow. And like I said, like the oil is the blood of this planet. So there's less blood flow, so the organism struggles. And again, less resources to the baby is an extra incentive for the birth, for triggering a birthing process. Because the baby, so long as it's nice and cozy in the womb and it's nice and spacious and you have infinite amount of energy that's streaming freely through the umbilical cord to you, why would you go through the birthing process? You're fine. You're there. The temperature is ideal. The climate is stable and everything is fine. And it's the same as a young adult living in his parents' house, as long as like mom does the cooking and the washing and dad brings in the money, and your room is, you have even like a cleaning lady that's cleaning your room for you and everything is done for you. What's the real incentive of actually leaving your parents' home? But if your parents say, okay, we've had enough, no more pocket money for you, and we won't do your washing, now you have to do your laundry yourself. I mean, had enough of this. And then they start running things terribly in the household. Then you're like, I'm getting out of here. And you see that same pattern repeating again at our level of reality, where you see these governments that are dysfunctional, that are not working as they should be again, and like, and you can either experience this first degree, which is like go in the streets and protest and ask the governments for being better or whatever, or you can just say, well, look. This is just a call for self-organization, for self-governance, because it's the logical next step, and then move gradually towards that. And it doesn't mean screw the state and let's just all self-organize into independent communities from day one. It is, the best transitions are always the gradual ones. It's never, like, again, like think of being a young adult. If from one day to another, you're just being kicked out of your parents' house with just a few clothes, and the parents say, go ahead, fend for yourself, good luck. And it's the same brutal kind of process that we are imposing upon our babies when they're born, and this clamping of the umbilical cord and the abrupt cutting of the placenta. It's quite violent if you think about it. And so shedding light on these patterns, maybe realizing that that's not the best option or the best solution, might reverberate fractally upwards and allow us to have a more gradual transition. And so I hope you found this kind of more spiritual or symbolic analysis of the situation interesting, and that you can have kind of a more bird's eye view of the challenges ahead and what we might be experiencing. And always try to think of yourself inside an organism, a giant organism, which doesn't have access to the symbolic dimension of what's happening on the outside. Meaning, if you are one cell inside the baby, and suddenly the umbilical cord is cut, you have no idea what just happened. All you know is there are less resources available within that organism that you're in. And you can give yourself, as little cell in that body, any kinds of explanations for what has happened. You can either have a more down-to-earth explanation, which is you'll explain this via an understanding of the internal biochemical flows inside the body and just say, oh, this is definitely something that is internal. There's an internal explanation for this. And that's typically your economic or geopolitical analysis that's happening today, is that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and this is all because of the US rivalry with Iran, and then you go into all these kinds of... Or you can try to view this event through a more symbolic lens, or also what astrology does is basically you're trying to access the archetype or the patterns that are there, that are out there, that is almost like accessing what's happening outside from the perspective of a cell inside the body. Like you're trying to actually understand that there's actually a doctor out there that cut the umbilical cord, and you experience that at your local cellular level as an event, a biochemical event that you can understand and comprehend and experience at your level as a little cell in that body. So again, view the different planets and the solar system as a giant informational system where, just like if you're on a boat on the ocean and there's a storm in the ocean, your boat is going to rock, and your experience within that boat is going to be dependent on the weather and whether there's stormy weather or whether the sea is calm. And in the same way, you could view the whole solar system as a giant ocean where there are waves, like energy discharges and all kinds of energetic flows and relationships between the different planets, which creates a kind of etherical or energetic weather, which we humans experience and which affects us in ways that are not necessarily just only biological, but also affects us at the level of our ideas, of our noesis, of the way that we think, the way that we act in the world based on our thinking. And there have been studies made, obviously, about like coinciding, stellar events or astronomical events and major moments in history, like the French Revolution or this and that. So that's all out there. The symbolic reading that I'm doing is, again, a similar kind of endeavor, with a little caveat, and that is that it's not that there's a fatality here. That is, space weather or the weather on the ocean is one thing, but how you navigate your boat, your ship, which is like humanity as a collective, in that storm is still up to us. And so it's just like if you're in the sea and there's a storm, you can either proactively try to swim, you can either just be passive and let the waves crash on you. There's so many things that you can actually do, which shifts your experience of that storm. And so, by the same token, the way that you navigate your ship in that storm might worsen your experience of that storm or might make it more positive as an outcome. And the same applies to, whatever is the transition that we're having right now, and with the events that are unfolding between Iran and the United States. It isn't a fatality, but it is a storm that we have to face. And I'm just hoping that we're going to face it in the most positive way possible. And which is why I'm publishing this video. Otherwise, there'd be no point in it. So yeah, I hope you found this video interesting. Don't hesitate to leave a comment, to like, share, subscribe. And you can also check out my other episodes if you want to. I also put the link in the description to Steve Keen's video. And hope you find this interesting, and talk to you next time, whenever that is.